Structuralism is a way of thinking that started in France in the 1950s. It first appeared in the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, an anthropologist, and Roland Barthes, a literary critic. It is hard to explain structuralism in just one sentence, but at its core, it is the idea that we cannot understand things on their own. We need to look at the larger systems or structures they belong to. That is why it is called structuralism. Structuralism spread to Britain mainly in the 1970s and became widely known in the 1980s. The structures structuralists talk about are not physical things but the ways our minds organize and understand the world. Because of this, structuralists believe that meaning does not exist inside a thing itself. Instead, meaning comes from how humans interpret it. In other words, we give things their meaning. It is not something they naturally have. Let's see how this idea works with literature. Suppose we are reading John Donne's poem, The Good Morrow. A structuralist would say that to understand this poem, we first need to understand the kind of poem it is reacting to or changing. This poem is related to a poetic form called Auba or dawn song, which comes from the 12th century. In this type of poem, lovers are sad because daybreak means they must leave each other. But to really understand the Auba, we also need to understand the idea of courtly love, a medieval tradition about romantic love. And since the Auba is a poem, we must also understand what poetry is and how it usually works. These are all examples of larger cultural structures that John Donne's poem is part of. So a structuralist does not just focus on Donne's poem by itself, they step back and look at these bigger ideas and traditions that shape the poem. In this way, structuralism leads us away from the specific poem and into broader ideas about genres, history, and philosophy. To explain it with a simple comparison, imagine chickens and eggs. The larger ideas like the Auba, courtly love, and poetry are the chickens. The individual poem is the egg. Structuralists think it is important to understand the chicken, the bigger system, than the egg, the single example. This is very different from how English literature was studied in places like Britain and the USA before structuralism. Back then, critics focused closely on the text itself, not on outside ideas. They preferred to study the egg alone. Flipped that idea, saying we should look at the bigger picture and ask deeper questions like what do we mean when we say something is literary? How do stories work? What makes something a poem? Traditional critics were not happy about this change. They did not like being told to focus less on the individual text and more on the big abstract ideas, the chickens. Though structuralism really started in the 1950s and 60s, its roots go back to the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. He played a major role in how we study language today. In the 1800s, most linguists were focused on the history of languages, where they come from and how they changed over time. But Saussure focused on how language works in the present. He was more interested in how we make and understand meanings and how grammar helps us to do that. So what did Saussure say that later structuralists found so important? His ideas can be summed up in three main points. First, language is arbitrary. Saussure said that words have no natural connection to the things they refer to. The meaning of a word comes only from social agreement. For example, there is nothing about the word hut that makes it naturally suited to mean a small house. We just all agree that it means that. Even words that sound like their meanings, like hiss or cuckoo, are not the same in every language. Language is based on arbitrary signs. This matters because it means language does not just mirror the world, it creates its own system. Language is separate from the actual things it talks about. Second, language is relational. Words do not get their meanings by themselves. Their meanings come from how they relate to other words. Take the word hut. Its meaning depends on where it sits in a chain of similar words like hovel, shed, hut, house, mansion, and palace. Each word is defined by its differences from others. A hut is different from a shed, which is usually used for storage. A mansion is bigger than a house but smaller than a palace. If you removed one word from the chain, the meaning of the others would shift. We also see this in word pairs. Think of male and female or good and bad. Each gets its meaning from being the opposite of the other. Saussure put it simply, in language meanings come from differences, not from fixed meanings. He even used the example of a train, the 825 from Geneva to Paris. It has a different engine, cars, and passengers each day. What makes it the 825 train is only its position in the timetable between 825 and 925 trains. Its identity is based on differences. Third, language shapes the world. For Saussure, language does not just describe the world, it creates it. We do not just name things that are already there. We make meaning through the words we choose. For example, calling someone a terrorist or a freedom fighter reflects a point of view. Neither word is neutral. They shape how we see the person. Another example, in the 1980s, the British government introduced a tax. Critics called it the poll tax, suggesting oppression, while the government called it the community charge, suggesting fairness. The term you used showed your political stance. There was no neutral name for it. Even colors and seasons are created by language. The color spectrum is continuous, but we divide it into 7 main colors. Why not 14? Seasons blend into each other, but we name 4 of them. We could have picked 6 or 8 instead. These labels are ways of seeing the world, not fixed truths. Langue and parole. Saussure made another useful distinction. Langue and parole. Langue is the full system of a language, its rules and structures. Parole is any individual use of that language. A sentence someone says, for example, a French sentence only makes sense if you understand the rules of French. Struck applied this to literature too. They saw each novel, like Middlemarch, as a parole, an individual example. To understand it, you need to see it as part of the broader system or genre, the langue of novels. What is the scope of structuralism? Structuralism is not just about language and literature. When Saussure's ideas about how language works were taken up in the 1950s by a group we now call Structuralists, they believed his theory could apply to more than just language. They thought it could explain how all systems of meaning work. Claude Lévi-Strauss, an anthropologist, used structuralism to study myths. Lévi-Strauss believed that an individual myth called parole does not have a full meaning by itself. Instead, it makes sense only when we see it as part of a whole group of related myths, langue. He studied the Oedipus myth by looking at all the related stories from Thebes. He noticed repeated themes and opposites like animal, human, stranger, relative, husband, son. These patterns helped him interpret the myth. This is a typical structuralist move, looking at the parts in relation to the bigger structure they belong to. This approach can be used in many ways. For example, You could study all the works of a single author or look at how a novel like Hard Times breaks or follows common rules of storytelling. Structuralists also look for basic opposites or dyads like female male or town country that show up again and again. A signifying system is any organized set of signs that carry meaning. This includes not just books but also rituals like graduation ceremonies or rain dances, fashion, food, car styles, and ads. Structuralists believe we can study culture as if it were a language because culture has many patterns and systems that create meaning. Fashion can be read like language. Clothes have their own grammar. For example, you do not wear an evening dress with slippers or a military uniform to a lecture. Every clothing item gets its meaning from how it fits in with the rest. Breaking the rules of fashion still makes a statement, but only because the rules exist to begin with. In the 1990s, for example, fashion that looked messy or inside out was actually a trend called deconstruction. On its own, crumpled jacket might just look sloppy, but when paired with other similar items, it becomes stylish. So again, the overall structure is more important than the individual piece. Roland Barthes was another major early structuralist. He studied modern French culture in his book Mythologies, published in 1957, using the structuralist approach. He looked at everyday things like wrestling, steak, and chips, the Citroën car, or photos of soldiers, and tried to find out what they meant by placing them in a larger cultural system. For example, he compared boxing and wrestling. Boxing is serious and rule based. The boxer hides pain and fights for themselves. Wrestling is theatrical. Wrestlers act like heroes or villains, show their pain and break rules. Each sport, Barth said, reflects different cultural values. Boxing teaches endurance, wrestling shows the drama of good versus evil. Barth also studied literature using this method, and by the 1970s, structuralism became very popular in Paris and around the world. English and American scholars began traveling to Paris, learning from French thinkers, and bringing back to their own universities. Some key figures who helped spread structuralism in the English speaking world include Jonathan Culler, an American critic who wrote Structuralist Poetics in 1975. Terence Hawkes, a British critic who wrote Structuralism and Semiotics in 1977. He also edited a book series called New Accents that aimed to bring fresh ideas into literary studies. Frank Kermode, a British professor, supported Barthes's ideas and organized seminars to study them. David Lodge, another British professor, tried to blend structuralist ideas with traditional literary criticism, especially in his book Working with Structuralism, published in 1980. What structuralist critics do? They mostly study stories, especially prose like novels, by connecting them to bigger patterns or systems such as the rules and expectations of a certain type of story, like detective stories or fairy tales. They link between this story and other stories. A basic story structure that might be common to all stories everywhere, and repeated patterns or ideas that show up in many stories. Structuralist critics look at stories using ideas from modern linguistics, the study of language. For example, Levi-Strauss came up with the idea of a mytheme, the smallest meaningful part of a story, which is like a morpheme in language, such as the ed at the end of a verb to show present tense. They also use the idea of patterns and structures to study not just literature, but all parts of culture. That means anything from old myths to soap brands can be seen as a system of science that carries meaning and can be analyzed. Roland Barthes' book, Yes Is It, published in the 1970s, is a detailed example of how structuralist literary analysis works. The book is about a short story called Sarrazin by Balzac, which is only about 30 pages long. Barthes breaks this story down into 561 small parts that he calls lexes, each representing a unit of meaning. He then studies each lexi using 5 codes that he believes lie behind all stories. In structuralism, the goal is to understand a single work by how it fits into a larger system. For Barthes, the system is these 5 codes, which help explain how all stories are formed, similar to how grammar helps create all possible sentences in a language. Some readers argue that SEZ is actually a post-structuralist text because it was written after Barthes' famous 1968 essay, The Death of the Author, which is often seen as the beginning of his post-structuralist period. However, many respected scholars still consider SEZ to be a structuralist work. Books like Terence Hawkes, Robert Scholes, and Jonathan Culler treat it this way. Even though SZ contains moments where Barthes seems to question or play with structuralism, the book still tries to show how complex stories can be broken down into simpler elements using the 5 codes. In this way, the book is both structuralist and post-structuralist, sitting somewhere in between. The 5 codes in SZ are the pro-aeretic, hermeneutic, cultural, semic, and symbolic codes. The pro-aeretic code involves actions in a story, the things that happen. The hermeneutic code is about mystery and suspense, the parts of a story that make the reader ask questions. The cultural code refers to knowledge that comes from outside that story, things the reader is expected to already understand, like stereotypes or shared cultural ideas. The semicode focuses on meanings connected to characters or themes, and the symbolic code explores deeper opposites like life and death, male and female, or reality and illusion. To understand how these codes work in a real story, Barthes' approach can be applied to Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Oval Portrait. In the story, a wounded man finds shelter in an abandoned castle. Inside, he sees a portrait of a young woman that looks very lifelike. He finds a written note that tells the story behind the painting. The woman was the painter's wife, and he became so obsessed with painting her that he did not realize she was slowly dying. When the painting is finished, the woman is dead. From a structuralist point of view, this story is built around many opposites and patterns. The story has 2 parts: the narrator's present experience and the story he reads about the portrait. The first part is calm and slow, the second part is intense and fast paced. The castle itself also changes meaning between the 2 parts. At first, it is a safe place for the wounded man, later, it becomes a place of suffering and death for the woman. There are also deeper contrasts. The painter is obsessed with his work instead of his wife, showing a conflict between artistic passion and romantic love. His dedication to art replaces his role as a husband. The time they spend together creating the painting is a twisted version of a honeymoon. He is deeply involved in his art, not in his marriage. Even the way the story is told shows patterns. Both narrators, the man in the present and the author of the story about the painting, are mostly anonymous. This makes us ask who is speaking, which is a question Barthes thought was important. In the second story, the writer observes events but does not interfere, suggesting either lack of awareness or indifference. These examples all show how the story is shaped by the contrasts and repeated patterns. If we simplify these even more, we get major opposites like life and art, male and female, light and dark, seeing and doing, or real life and representation. Structuralists believe that such opposites are the basic framework behind all narratives. The main opposition in the Oval Portrait is between art and life. The story seems to support art more than life, since the artistic creation is described in powerful, passionate language, while the laws of life feels secondary. The painter's passion for his work is a central focus, even though it leads to tragedy. This is a key idea in structuralist criticism, that stories are built from repeated patterns and oppositions that structure the meaning even more than any clear moral or personal